everyone. Welcome back to Crime in Court. We are reading through the Delphi trial transcript, and this is the state's case, part 30 in Indiana versus Richard Allen. Stacy Bozinovski is still on the stand. She is a forensic scientist. She is going through all the different things that she tested for DNA or any kind of biological material, all the different items that she received in the lab and what she tested. So we're in the middle of that testimony. She's still on direct with Mr. Luttrell, I believe. Yes, Mr. Luttrell is doing the questioning for the state. So let us begin. We are coming back from our morning break on this day. So let me shrink myself here. Okay, find my mouse. All right. So, the court says we're back on the record. The court says, okay, we're back on the record. I know we're waiting for Mr. McLeland and Mr. Luttrell. All right, Mr. Luttrell, have you switched out all of your evidence? Mr. Luttrell says, I have, Your Honor. The court says, okay, are we ready to proceed? Mr. Luttrell says, as expeditiously as I can. Okay, let's bring them in, says the court. The bailiff says, all rise. The jury enters the courtroom. The bailiff says, thank you, you may be seated. Court says, thank you, gentlemen. All right, you may proceed. Mr. Luttrell. Mr. Luttrell says, thank you, Your Honor, and he continues with direct examination of the witness. And now to transition, ma'am, to your March 24th, 2017 report. And in that matter, you looked at items removed from the body of Abby Williams at the autopsy, the 3 garments. Is that correct? Yes, that included 3 garments. And also items obtained at the crime scene, and then a number of items removed from the creek. That's how they were described to you. Is that correct? Yes, that is the description I received. Let's look first at taken in those groups. I have for the record States Exhibits 178, 179, 180, and 170. Oh my God, I cannot talk. 181. These are identified as your lab numbers 31, 32, and 33. Is it okay if I give a little bulky? You want to handle those 3? Yes, sir. The first item, your lab item 31, was a pink top, a sleeveless pink top from the body of Abby Williams. And the second item is the gray cotton bra, your item 32, and the black bra is item 33. Would you explain to the jury, item by item, what your results were of your examination? Yes, sir. These clothing items were examined for the presence of body fluids. Blood was detected on the pink sleeveless shirt from Abby Williams and the gray bra from Abby Williams. There was no seminal material detected on either of those 2 items or on the other bra, which was the black bra. No seminal material was detected. The black bra did indicate the possible presence of blood, but there was no confirmatory testing done on item 33, whereas blood was confirmed on items 31 and 32. In addition, I collected hair from those items for DNA analysis as well. When the DNA results for all 14 cuttings that I took from the pink sleeveless shirt, all of them were consistent with Abby Williams and estimated to occur once in more than 8 trillion unrelated individuals. 3 of the 14 cuttings indicated the presence of an additional allele, so just 1 allele, but there was no conclusion drawn from that information. The hair from the pink sleeveless shirt, there were 2 hairs, human with root. One of them did not have enough DNA for analysis. The other hair was found to be consistent with Abby Williams and also estimated to occur once in more than 8 trillion individuals. Moving to the gray bra, there were 2 cuttings of blood taken from the bra. Both of those cuttings were found to be consistent with Abby Williams and occur once in more than 8 trillion unrelated individuals. Why are they why are they grouping items together? Like, why doesn't the attorney ask, "Can you go through item number 31? What is that? What did you find?" Like instead of let me tell you everything that I found on all three of these items. Make the jury remember everything that I'm saying in this big long diatribe of words, and you're supposed to remember everything when you could just like break it down really easily, one item at a time. He keeps doing this with this witness, and I don't understand why. It's very frustrating for me. And I'm not even, it's not me as a juror having to listen to that. She says, moving to the gray bra, there were two cuttings of blood taken from the bra. Both of those cuttings were found to be consistent with Abby Williams and occur once in more than 8 trillion unrelated individuals. There were three swabs of the bra. These swabs were taken from the breast area of the bra inside and outside for the collection of possible skin cells. Two of the three swabs were found to be consistent with Abby Williams and estimated to occur once in more than 8 trillion unrelated individuals. The third swab from the bra was found to be a mixture of at least two individuals. A major profile was determined, which was consistent with Abby Williams and estimated to occur once in more than 8 trillion unrelated individuals. The minor profile, I was not able to determine the number of contributors in that minor profile, so there were no conclusions drawn about it. The hair from the bra failed to demonstrate a sufficient amount of DNA. The black bra, there were four cuttings taken of that bra, and then there were two swabs taken of the bra. Two of the cuttings indicated a single source profile consistent with Abby Williams and it was estimated to occur once in more than 8 trillion unrelated individuals. The other two cuttings indicated the presence of a mixture of at least two individuals, and the major profile in each of those cuttings was found to be consistent with Abby Williams, and there was no conclusion drawn about the minor profile due to the uncertainty of the number of contributors. The swabs of the bra, which again were from the inside breast area of the bra, were found to both be consistent with Abby Williams. And then finally, the hair collected from the bra, which there were four hairs consistent with human with root material. All four of them failed to demonstrate a sufficient amount of DNA for further analysis. I am finding it wild that they have so many hair samples with roots, and yet they can't find a DNA profile for it. They're saying it's insufficient to create a DNA profile, which I think is BS. I I call BS. I with the root especially is like the way that you can get DNA extracted from a hair follicle. So why are we not I don't understand why we're not able to do so this is at least 3 4 cases in this particular case, 3 4 instances where they have the root of a hair and they can't analyze it. It just makes me wonder, why are we hiding people here? Is there a reason, like what's going on that they can't do that? When you're talking about a single source conclusion and you identify and express it that it's consistent with Abby Williams, for example, then you add a number that says something like 8 trillion. Would you give that phrase again and explain why you would word it that way? So my report says the DNA profile obtained from the cuttings of the bra are consistent with Abby Williams and are estimated to occur once in more than 8 trillion unrelated individuals. So this is a statistical calculation provided to give some weight or meaning behind the profile that I have determined from the sample, and it is essentially a stat that's showing the rarity of that profile. So it is my chance of selecting another unrelated person in the population that would be consistent or match that profile. So essentially, I would not expect to find another person in the population to match that profile, or my chance of doing so would be one in more than 8 trillion unrelated individuals. So I often say if I had a room of 8 trillion individuals, there maybe one other person who would have a profile that matches or is consistent with that sample. Thank you. I'm going to hand you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 157, admitted into evidence as such, and it's identified as a black Nike tennis shoe. You've already testified about examining the Converse shoe from Abby Williams. Is this identified as an item found underneath the body? Yes. This is a black Nike shoe. My laboratory item 39 that was identified to me as being recovered under the body of Abby Williams. You examined it? Yes, sir. By the way, for the record, did you receive that item? Are you able to tell from your current documents you have open from whom you received it? Yes, sir. And who is that? I have received this item and the other items I just mentioned from Sergeant Brian Olahy through an evidence transaction that was included another officer in my building, Lieutenant Berkey, who facilitated that evidence transaction. What were the results of your examination of the Nike tennis shoe found below Abby Williams' body? This item, the same visual exam that I perform in all items to note the condition of the item as well as to determine what type of testing needs to be performed. I determined that there was blood present on the shoe, so blood was detected. There were 7 swabs of the shoe collected. In addition, I collected 2 other swabs of the shoe. I also observed hair and did a microscopic examination for hair, but the hair did not have root material present or was consistent with animal hair. The swabs from the shoe, 3 of the 7 were found to be consistent with Abby Williams and is estimated to occur once in more than 8 trillion unrelated individuals. 4 of the 7 swabs did not have enough DNA for further analysis. The 2 additional samples that I took were one was consistent with Abby Williams, and the other was a mixture in which I couldn't determine the number of contributors that were reasonably present in that sample, so I could not determine or make any conclusions. Do shoes in your experience, pose challenges or yield results that lay people may not understand or anticipate? I mean, shoes have the same types of challenges and this shoe in particular, that all shoes have. They are covered in dirt. And dirt is when you're swabbing it for potential skin cells, you're also collecting all that environment insults as well. And then also, we wear them every day. We wear them into public places. We wear them, in our homes. So they're a good item to collect a lot of DNA as well. Was this shoe, the Nike shoe, was it the same or different in terms of what you noted of the dirt or soil as compared to the Converse shoes? Was it similar? I'm going to refer to my notes just to recall. Yes, the shoe was in the same condition. I've noticed that it was heavy soil and plant material present throughout the shoe. Thank you. I'm going to hand you now envelopes that are admitted into evidence as States Exhibit 158 through 167, noted as being various swabs from blood areas near and around the bodies of the victims. Beginning with 158 of your item 40, would you mind telling us if you recognize those envelopes? Did they contain evidence that you examined and what your results were? So, you have handed me States Exhibits 158 through 167, my laboratory items 40 through 49. I have examined all of these items and do have results. Beginning with States Exhibit 158 and your item 40, would you tell us what those are? If I may, I will try grouping those items to the best of my ability, beginning with a grouping of items 40 through items 43, items 46, and items 47. All of those are swabs from the ground or swabs from trees. The blood was detected on all of those items. All of the swabs were found to be consistent with the DNA profile of Libby German and is estimated to occur once in more than 8 trillion unrelated individual swabs. So swabs from the ground and the trees at the crime scene they tested positive for Libby's blood. Swabs of the ground, item 44 and item 45. Blood was also detected, and those profiles were found to be consistent with Abby Williams and is estimated to occur once in more than 8 trillion unrelated individuals. And finally, items 48 and 49 were swabs from the left index finger and left pinky finger of Libby German, and serological testing was performed on those swabs, and it indicated the possible presence of blood. I did not perform confirmatory testing on either swab to preserve it for DNA analysis. The results from both the swab of the left pinky finger and left index finger both were found to be consistent with Libby German and occur more than once in more than 8 trillion unrelated individuals. Is it a fair summary, an accurate summary, that these swabs taken from the ground or the tree, 7 of them, the 2 you noted is from ground near between Tree and Abby Williams, and the red stain below the head of Abby Williams were the only ones that had the DNA profile of Abby Williams. Is that correct? I did not understand that question whatsoever because he changed it so many times. She says yes, only those 2. So he says what? That only those 2 swabs between the tree and Abby, the red stain below the head of Abby, were the only ones that had Abby's DNA. She says yes. The items taken from the swabs of the finger of Libby German and the left pinky of Libby German, as well as swabs from the ground area of a blood area between marker 3 and 4, a swab from the ground at the feet of Libby, a swab from the ground below Libby's head, swabs of the ground near the tree with blood on it, swab from the tree with red stain, swab with red stain from the tree below the previous item. Those were all whose DNA? All of the swabs that you've just mentioned were consistent with the DNA profile of Libby German. You were provided a number of items that were identified as collected by CSI Sergeant Jim Cody and designated as coming from the creek. Is that correct? I don't recall who the items were collected by. Okay, but they were identified as having come from the creek? Yes, sir. And I'll try to group them as easily as possible, but I'm going to show you first States Exhibit 140. Ask if you can identify that. States Exhibit 140 is a package that contains a sweatshirt that was recovered from the creek. My item 68. 148. States Exhibit 141. States Exhibit 141 is laboratory item 69, which is a pair of underwear recovered from the creek. 142. 142 is laboratory item 70, which is a sock that was recovered from the creek. 143. States Exhibit 143 is laboratory item 71, which is also a sock. 144. States Exhibit 144 is laboratory item 72, which is a green scarf, a head scarf, that was recovered from the creek. It's like a bandana, isn't it? It's not like a head scarf. I mean, I wouldn't call it a head scarf. I would call it a bandana. 145. States Exhibit 145 is laboratory item 78, which is a tank top shirt recovered from the creek. By the way, that green scarf, head scarf, or whatever she calls it, the green bandana, not the girls. So, why was it found with their items? Don't know. States Exhibit 148 is laboratory item 78, which is the tank top recovered from the creek. Apologize for changing the sequence here, but we're going to look at Exhibit 138, or excuse me, States Exhibits 137, 138, and 139. I'll hand you first 137. States Exhibit 137 is laboratory item 65, which is the other Nike shoe which was recovered from the creek. Exhibit 138. Laboratory item 66, a pair of blue jeans also indicated as recovered from the creek. Exhibit 139. States Exhibit 139 is laboratory item 67, which is a tie-dyed shirt, excuse me, also recovered from the creek. That would be Libby's t-shirt. Did the being found in the creek, did that pose any challenges for you as a DNA analyst? I believe that it did. I believe that affected my overall results from the items that were recovered in that from that area. Why do you believe that? The creek. Well, based off of my results, first of all, like I mentioned, I am able to detect inhibition and degradation in my results. And so I have metrics that support that those factors were indeed present on the samples that I examined. But the creek in itself, a water source, is going to have the potential to remove DNA or dilute DNA. It's also introducing a number of environmental impacts that are known to affect DNA analysis, such as dirt, bacteria, even factors like sunlight can affect the overall success of DNA. Were you able to just go through your results, summarize it for the jury, and proceed in the order to identify the item that you're talking about, the order that's most convenient with you for your notes? So we'll start with Nike shoe, laboratory item 65. I examined that shoe again. It was heavily soiled item, but I did attempt to collect any type of skin cells that may be present on that shoe. There was no blood, there was no seminal material. That type of testing was performed on the staining that was visible. There were 5 swabs collected from the shoe. One of the swabs was found to be consistent with Abby Williams and estimated to occur once in more than 8 trillion unrelated individuals. 2 of the swabs gave me a partial DNA profile in which I wouldn't or couldn't determine the number of contributors, so I could not make any conclusions. An additional sample failed to demonstrate enough DNA, so overall, I was only able to obtain a DNA profile from 1 swab of that shoe. Moving to the jeans. If I could just stop you there, this was a shoe unlike the shoes found on Abby Williams, the Converses. This is a shoe that is the other half or matches what you could tell. The shoe found underneath Abby, is that correct? That's correct. Would you be surprised, given your finding, that it was identified as Libby German's shoe? Would I be surprised by the result? Maybe that's a dumb question or a trick question. Can you answer it? Well, I would just say that I can't really tell you how someone's DNA profile gets onto an item. That particular swab that I identified, the DNA profile of Abby Williams, was from the sides of the shoe, so the rubber sole on the bottom. That portion was swabbed, and there it yielded a single source profile consistent with Abby Williams. So I can't make any conclusions on how she would have gotten there. It's I wouldn't find it unreasonable of a result, but I can't say how it got there. Fair enough. Next item you wanted to discuss was that which one? Moving on to the genes. The genes again, heavy dirt, mud staining present, plant material was present. I attempted to swab some areas of the genes, so there were 2 swabs of the genes collected for possible skin cells. Those swabs were again from the button and the zipper of the jeans and from the inside crotch area of the jeans. That sample from the inside of the jeans did yield a mixture of 2 individuals. There was a major profile determined, and that major profile was consistent with Abby, and then an estimated to occur once in more than whatever, the 8 trillion number again that she keeps throwing out there. We get it, lady, we get it. There was also a minor profile. The minor profile was found to be consistent with Libby and estimated to occur once in 7.6 million unrelated individuals. And then the second swab from the zipper and the buttons showed the presence of a mixture, but I could not determine number of contributors and therefore no further conclusions. And if I can elaborate on number of contributors, these mixtures were very partial in nature because of the inhibition and degradation present, so I had enough DNA present to develop a profile. I had a profile, but the profile was very, very limited information, and most of that information was falling below thresholds that we have in the laboratory that allow me to make conclusions off of. So that that essentially means there's additional information below my thresholds that indicates that I have multiple contributors. What is she talking about? So I cannot just be confident that there's only a third person present or that there's only a fourth person present. So I cannot determine how many, but and by interpreting those kinds of samples, that would pose a risk of making false inclusions and exclusions. The next item. The next item is the tie-dyed shirt. The tie-dyed shirt was just very heavily stained with mud. It had possible plant material as well. I did test several areas within this shirt. Again, it's covered in mud, so I can't see. If there was a blood stain on it, I would not have been able to see it. So I was randomly testing and targeting areas within the mud. However, no blood was detected, no seminal material was detected. I did take one cutting off of the sweatshirt, or excuse me, no blood was detected. No seminal material was detected. There was one hair with that shirt, but that hair failed to demonstrate a sufficient amount of DNA. The sweatshirt, which was a zip up hooded sweatshirt, what color? Did you note the color? Yes, I noted that it was gray. It was very light in color. I noted gray. This is Abby's zip up sweatshirt. It could have been gray from dirt, but it looked gray to me. It appeared slightly dirty with slight plant material. It was cleaner than some of the other items recovered from the creek. I detected several areas on that sweatshirt that were enhanced with fluorescent lighting, so they fluoresced, but it didn't give the visual appearance of a seminal material stain or a saliva stain. It was very streaky in nature, so it kind of appeared like maybe detergent or some kind of chemical stain. So it all tested negative for blood and seminal material, but I did want to attempt DNA analysis on that fluorescing areas. So 7 swabs were taken off of the sweatshirt and one cutting was taken. And from all of those areas, most of them, all 7 swabs did not have enough DNA for further analysis. The cutting just gave me a partial DNA profile in which I couldn't determine number of contributors. Thus, moving to the underwear was examined for blood and seminal material, and no blood or seminal material was detected. I took one cutting of the underwear and then 2 swabs of the underwear. The first swab was from the inside crotch area of the underwear, and the second was from the waistband of the underwear, and those samples 3 of the samples, excuse me, from the cutting of the underwear. I did 3 additional target testings within the cutting, and all of them are consistent with Abby Williams. So that was the underwear had staining inside of the underwear, as you might expect, and I tested that staining, and all of the staining was consistent with Abby Williams. And then from the swabs, which were the waistband and the inside, that also was consistent with Abby Williams. The sock, there was a black sock, item 70. I tested that for blood and seminal material. Nothing was detected, but I did take 2 swabs of kind of the opening of the sock because I don't know if anyone really knew if it was directly correlated with our victims or not. So I took 2 swabs to see who might have been wearing the sock. Both of those swabs failed to demonstrate enough DNA for further analysis. And I also collected 3 human with root, and all of those also failed to demonstrate enough DNA. So again, another incident with a hair with a root, and you can't get DNA from it. The other sock was a pink sock. Again, no blood or seminal material was detected. There were swabs taken of the sock to determine whose sock it may have been or worn by, and then 3 hairs were also retained from the sock for DNA analysis. Those 3 hairs also failed to demonstrate enough DNA for further analysis. The sock swabs gave me a partial DNA profile, which I couldn't determine number of contributors. There was a green scarf, laboratory item 72, submitted. The green scarf from my visual examination appeared very old. It was embedded with the mud and, in my opinion, may not have been related to the timing of this crime, but I did examine that scarf and I completed examination for the presence of blood and seminal material, and there was nothing detected, and there were no other analysis performed. Item 78 was a tank top shirt, and that shirt was very much in the same condition as other items. Heavy dirt and mud present, plant material present, and I tested several areas on the shirt for the presence of blood and seminal material, and again, nothing was detected. However, I did take swabs of the breast area of the inside of the shirt for possible skin cells, and I did recover DNA with root from that hair for DNA analysis. All of the samples failed to demonstrate a sufficient quantity of DNA with the exception of one, which yielded a partial profile in which I could not make conclusions. Did you cover I apologize, your item 67, the tie-dye shirt? Yes, I did. Was that, did that complete your examination of items from the creek? Of the items that were submitted to you? Yes, sir. And did we go through the entire March 24th report? I believe there's one additional sample. It's just a swab of a tree, item 86. Okay. That was a tree that was identified as coming from where? It says a swab of a tree below Rock Trail on east side of High Bridge. I think it was just a swab in which I think it's a swab which was just collected to see if anyone may have touched that tree. Regardless, I did not perform any serological testing, so I didn't warrant testing for blood or anything, and there wasn't any DNA present on that swab. Thank you. We have talked about your examination of numerous items on March 7th and March that resulted in a report issued on March 7th and March 24th. In those, you did not find a profile of a male. You were not able to develop the DNA profile of any male. Is that correct? From those two reports we talked about, I was not able to identify a male profile. Your next report was April 11th. Is that correct? Yes, sir. And did that involve a re-examination of you of a black hooded sweatshirt recovered from the body of Abby Williams? Yes. And did it also include an examination of your item 263, Indiana or States Exhibit 167, identified as a swab from the iPhone of Libby German? That report does not contain my examination of laboratory item 263, which was identified to me as a swab of cell phone found under Abby. I'm going to hand to you. Is this the envelope that you received that you examined the contents of? Yes, sir. I recognize this envelope, States Exhibit 169, as my item 263. Let's start with that one first, and we'll come back to the sweatshirt. What was the result of your examination of the swab from the iPhone? There were two swabs present in item 263. I did not perform any serological testing, which means there wasn't any blood-like staining present on that sample. I took those swabs directly to DNA analysis, and both of the swabs demonstrated the presence of a mixture in which the number of contributors could not reasonably be assumed. Therefore, no conclusions were drawn. On the black hoodie, what did you do on this second examination of the sweatshirt? In the second examination, I went back to the sweatshirt and decided to take some additional samples of that sweatshirt. So initially, I had done what serological testing on the sweatshirt for the presence of blood and seminal material, and I had tested all those areas, and I had done three swabs from the sweatshirt initially, from the cuffs and the pockets of the sweatshirt, and I had chose those areas originally because those are, in my opinion, those are areas that may have come in contact with a suspect. So I was interested in seeing if I could get some skin cells off of those areas. Given that the sweatshirt was of importance, in that it was in the middle of the crime scene and the front of the sweatshirt was not as exposed to some of the environmental insults that the creek items were exposed to. I wanted to go back and do some maybe untraditional swabbing of that sweatshirt. So I went back and I swabbed the majority of the front of the sweatshirt and the sleeves, both front and back, of the black hooded sweatshirt to potentially collect any type of skin cells that may have been deposited within those areas. Would you tell the jury the results? Sorry, would you tell the jury the results of your analysis of those items? I apologize in advance. I took 22 swabs from the sweatshirt, so in doing so, my attempt was to avoid the blood like staining that I also knew to be present on the front of the sweatshirt. I will try to group as best as I can. The one swab of the sweatshirt yielded a mixture of three individuals. Sweatshirt, three individuals. I was able to do some additional interpretation of this swab of the sweatshirt using the DNA standards of Abby and Libby. I assumed them as contributors in that three-person mixture, and so I was able to essentially deduce out a profile, and that profile was found to be consistent with an unknown male. Unknown male. So not Richard Allen's, because you would have his DNA on profile. Let's go ahead. And were you going to go on to discuss other items? Yes, sir. Let's go ahead and address that. You later did more analysis on that mixture, which you noted as 29A and B, black hoodie, and your item 29D, 10. Did I have that designation and sub-item correct? That's correct. 29 is the your number for the sweatshirt. D10 is the sub-item you created, which was a swab, and it had the mixture of three people. What were you able to determine about this third person, the unknown male? Well, I had an unknown male profile initially. Later on, I should say, I entered the unknown profile into our CODIS database system to be searched against any profile or potential offender samples. Later on, I wanted to enhance that profile as much as possible, so at a much later date, I was able to use new technologies. So, we talked about earlier, the forensic community is always changing, and so I used a newer technology to help with interpretation of that sample. In doing so, I ran my unknown profile through an employee database for a second time and was able to get a match to that unknown profile to an employee sample. So, therefore, it was removed from the CODIS database and no longer searched because of that identification. Huh? I'm confused. And that personnel, was that a lab employee? It was a laboratory personnel person. And your protocol is that and this is part of your QA QC program, correct? That you do not identify that person? Yes, sir. And just to elaborate, running our unknown profiles through an employee database is also part of our QA and QC profile. That was done initially and it was done again a second time. It did not match to the employee database the first time because that employee was not in the database the first time where they should have been, and it was not. So, as part of our quality assurance quality control program, a collective action was placed. So, was the sample contaminated with this person's DNA? Is that what we're getting at? But you're not saying it outright? Were there also changes made in terms of laboratory personnel and crime scene investigators sometime after 2017 in terms of their a protocol to follow in terms of apparel to wear? Did that occur sometime after 2017? I can't say for certain. I'm not really involved in the training of our CSIs, but I do know that because of this particular instance, it was communicated as to what would be appropriate personal protective equipment to be used at a crime scene. So, encouraging the use of a mask In close proximity to this type of work, close proximity to a certain type or individuals, something, something, I don't know, because we've got our first inaudible, which came 40 minutes in. So it took a while. But we haven't had a sidebar. So usually the court reporter can understand what the attorney and the witness are saying. It's when the sidebars happen where it's inaudible, inaudible, inaudible all over the place. But now we have it during a question here. Anyways, the witness says, I cannot say what exactly was communicated because I really don't know. I was not privileged to that conversation. I just know that the conversation existed. What will proceed with the rest of your examination? Were you able to group any of the items or sub-items? I will speak in generalities if that's permissible. The rest of the samples essentially were mixtures of two individuals in which Abby Williams and the major DNA profile and Abby was the major DNA profile and the minor profile was found to be Libby. And I'm speaking in generalities because the statistical support for each of those results does vary given the amount of genetic material that was used in that statistical calculation for each. But overall, any mixture with a two-person result was found to be consistent with Abby Williams as the major profile and Libby as the minor profile to the swabs taken from the sweatshirt. That pertains to a handful of the samples. There were some of the samples in which I was able to make conclusions from the major profile and then no conclusion about the minor profile, and in each of those instances, the major profile was also consistent with Abby Williams and the minor profile was consisting of at least two individuals, and I just couldn't draw a conclusion about that as well. Then, from 9 of the samples demonstrated a mixture in which I couldn't make any conclusions about at all. Other than the lab personnel, you found no male DNA on the sweatshirt? I found male DNA on the sweatshirt. I'm sorry, you could not develop a profile of the male DNA? That's correct. And in terms of the male DNA that you found on the sweatshirt, is there any more that you can say about it? No, just that in that quantitation, sorry, just that in that quantitation method that I mentioned earlier, I am able to detect the presence of male DNA, and most of those mixtures did indeed have the presence of male DNA present. I just did not determine an unknown male profile from any of those samples. Wasn't that convenient? You have a shit ton of samples of this unknown male DNA, but you just can't make a profile out of it. I find that suspicious. They can't make profiles out of the roots. They can't make profiles out of all the many instances that you have male DNA on one of the victims in this case. You just can't do it somehow. I don't know. I know there's limitations to forensics, but I find this suspicious. Of all the years that I've been following true crime, which has been pretty much my whole life, I find it suspicious that all these samples that you have, you just can't get a viable sample out of it, or a viable profile out of it, I should say. It doesn't make any sense to me. Again, we talked about clothing earlier and individuals living within a home with other individuals. Is it unusual on clothing to have DNA or partial DNA on items of clothing that that person has never worn? So, clothing is, given the substrate that of clothing, it's able to hold onto DNA, and then when you launder DNA as well, DNA can be deposited. So, a lot of times we think that cleaning and washing our clothes will remove the DNA. In fact, it's not, it's probably mixing the DNA from past washes in the current wash. So, yeah, I often say that clothing has background DNA. So, this morning, my husband gave me a hug. I have DNA from him. I've talked to Jim. I've talked to several other people today. So clothing can actually kind of hold on to the DNA from everyday interactions. yet you can't get any viable profiles out of it. I'm going to ask you about a report that you generated that was dated July 11th, 2017, and ask, did that it co- did that consist of examination by you and your results on looking at tree branches? Yes, sir. Would you tell the jury where you went to examine and begin your collection and analysis of the tree branches? Yes, I examined a few items containing tree branches, and that examination was done at the Indiana State Police Lafayette post where those items were being stored. Were they in a secure location in a building with other evidence items? Yes, they were. But this was an outbuilding of the post. Is that correct? That's how it was explained to me. Yes. How did you What did you do with these branches? Explain to the jury. Well, I essentially converted a conference room into an examination area, so I was able to provide for myself a clean examination surface with clean bench paper, and I brought forth some of the laboratory supplies, but I examined the tree branches essentially for the presence of any blood that may have been there. But I was primarily interested in collecting skin cells or swabs for possible skin cells from the tree branches. So, in my examination, I took several swabs from each of the branches for maybe how that tree branch may have been handled, and then I also collected some swabs for possible blood. I did not perform any of my serological testing at the Lafayette post. I just took the swabs back to my laboratory and did my laboratory testing once I returned. And the results of your examination? So, for grouping purposes, I took several swabs from each of the branches. So, imagine a lot of the branches were upwards of 7 feet long. So, I partitioned that into sections. And then I also kept in mind, like, if you were to handle or move that branch, how would you have done it so in my swabbing? And then all of those swabs essentially failed to demonstrate a sufficient quantity of DNA, or they had that failed quantification test control, and that test control, again, is an indicator of inhibition. So I had several of the samples indicate that inhibition. There were two samples that I was able to get a DNA profile from the branches. One was from laboratory item 547. This is my a swab of the branch which did test positive for blood. Excuse me. Oh, there you go. I wanted to make sure. Yes, it did test positive for blood, and that profile was found to be consistent with the profile of Libby. Then a second swab, which also tested positive for blood, which was my item 548, 547, and 48. Both of those items had a sample that was tested positive for blood. Both were consistent with Libby. Did those branches pose unique problems for you with trying to swab and collect and then to be able to examine? I mean, I can only imagine that those branches, being that they were, as far as an evidentiary item, impacted my ability to get a profile. So the branches are covered in dirt and swabbing it. I'm picking up the plant material, the particulates from the dirt. And dirt is a known inhibitor. The humic acid within the dirt is known as an inhibitor in our process, so I do believe it played a role. Ma'am, I'd like to conclude by going over some topics that relate overall to the work that you did, and you might draw our attention to some specific items in this examination that you've covered already. But you've talked about the inhibitors and degradation besides the branches. What other items come to mind that pose difficulty in you dealing with the inhibitors that were on and the degradation? It's difficult to name items. I would say, well, let me ask you specifically and then you can comment. What about the genes found on the body of Abby? Do I think that I was dealing with inhibitors? Yes. Yes. What about the clothes from the creek? Yes, like I mentioned earlier, these items were covered in dirt and mud and plant material. They were exposed to water and sunlight, and even though they may not have been over a long course of time, all of that plays a factor in my ability to recover DNA from these types of items. What about the nature of, given your experience, the nature of your item 16, States Exhibit 148, Winchester Smith& and Wesson? There's like a little gnat that keeps flying around my face. Driving me crazy. Sorry. Um, Let me start that question over again. What about the nature of, given your experience, the nature of your item 16, States Exhibit 148, Winchester Smith& and Wesson 40 cartridge? How would you characterize that difficulty? Do you know why the laboratory no longer accepts those to examine? Yes. The item 16, the cartridge, again, is a very small surface area. It's unusually minimally handled in general, so it's kind of like a one time contact. It's not something that is frequently handled over and over. So I really haven't expressed, I guess, that the success of skin cells, again, based on quantity and quality, is based on frequency of use, how much something is handled, how much skin cells can be deposited. And for DNA to be successful, I need to minimally be able to detect, between 25 and 50 cells. And a surface area like a cartridge being so small, that type of DNA, that level of DNA isn't typically deposited on such a small surface area. Another topic I wanted to ask you about that we include is hair. What I think you've indicated that hair is transient. Explain what you mean by that and what challenges would hair impose to you as a DNA analyst. First, just the challenges of hair. Hair is typically naturally shed from our body, so in that naturally shedding process, the follicles and the skin cells kind of shrink. And when shrinking happens, that's, what helps shed that hair. And when the shrinking happens, then the cells can kind of burst, the nuclei burst, which means the DNA starts degrading and it happens quickly. So, for hair to be successful, it has to kind of have like a skin tag present, and the best way to get skin present on a hair is through forcibly removing hair, and naturally shed hair isn't typically very successful. Overall, I can give you just from the first report that I looked at, I examined like 80 hairs and got one DNA profile out of 80 hairs. So it's just not a very good source of DNA. But as far as hair being transient, there's also the question of, since hair can easily move from a person, place, thing, an object, then it's also a question of how meaningful is hair in a forensic examination when it can easily be transferred, between locations. Is she trying to minimize these hairs that could be Kelsey's by saying, oh, well, it could have just traveled easily? I don't know. I don't think it's on her to give some kind, I don't know. Okay, anyways. I don't want to get into the details, but just to quickly touch the surface of rootless DNA, rootless hair technology, there are explorations underway to how to deal with hair that has no root or has no skin attached. And in light of that, did you send hair or hairs to the FBI? I did send a set of hairs to the FBI. It wasn't necessarily because of the rootless hair technology at the time, but the rootless hair technology has come to the forefront as newer technology that's available for hairs in which there is no longer a root. Did you ask, or did the FBI provide you a screening service to help you focus on hairs that might be of some value? They did provide a screening source to help identify hairs, and it's for a testing that wouldn't have been for me or my laboratory, as we had done everything that we could with the hairs. The only thing that hair can be, and the only thing that our laboratory can do with hair, is hair has hair that has a root, and we would perform an autosomal STR technology. So we did send a set of hairs to the FBI to identify through their laboratory to identify what hairs may have been not consistent with the victims so that we could consider any type of future testing. And at the time, the testing was mitochondrial analysis, which again is not performed in my laboratory. So she does paternity testing, so that's on your father's side. Any kind of DNA analysis using your father's side of your DNA. Whereas this is mitochondrial means maternal. They don't do maternal. Since that time in 2018, when I sent the hair to the FBI, the rootless hair technology has kind of come into discussion. Were these generally short hairs that you sent? There actually was a variety of hair sent, so anything that I had identified as a human hair, long or short, and even if I'd already identified a profile, except for the ones that I already knew to be consistent with Abby Williams, I went ahead and sent to the FBI. And what returned to you as identified as unlike the victim's hairs? How many? The FBI issued a report, and that report indicated to me that they found three hairs. Objection, hearsay, says Ms. Auger. Court says, any response? Mr. Luttrell says, I think as a DNA analyst and expert in this area, she's able to report that she learned from colleagues and consultants that she deals with, and I think this would be in that vein that she could go ahead and communicate the answer to the question I posed, which was how many hairs did they identify as unlike the victims. I think I wouldn't go any further, but I think that's appropriate for her since she was relying uh, up on that. But as an expert herself, Your Honor, I believe she would be able to do that. And the objection goes to the weight of the evidence and not the admissibility. Overruled. How many hairs did they submit to you with that designation? Did you tell us? I did start to answer. Their laboratory report, which was addressed to me, did identify three hairs that they found to be not consistent just from a microscopic examination to either Abby or Libby. Three hairs. And how many did you send them? I sent them 72 hairs. What was the next step then? If you have those three hairs, did you explore the possibility of a rootless hair examination of those three hairs? Yes. Our investigators inquired about what more could be done with those hairs, and that was explored as an option. What did you conclude after determining the options and what the limitations and characteristics of that examination would be? Well, I don't really make any conclusion, so I guess what did you learn? Yes, my role and the role of my supervisor, who's also the case manager of our laboratory at the time, was just to kind of research what technologies that were present in the forensic community and present that to our investigators so that they could make conclusions and choices on what type of testing may be needed to perform, if any, on that hair. What did you learn about the success rate of that technology? So, our research, and with consulting with actually not several, a few private companies that do that type of testing, show that their success rate for rootless hair testing was very low, and overall, it might be better to not perform that testing at this time and wait for technologies to improve. And if testing it, what would happen to the sample? What happens to that if you test it? Given the amount of hair that is needed for rootless hair testing and even mitochondrial analysis, it would most likely consume that hair in its entirety. There needs to be at least 5 centimeters of hair for the type of testing. Given the low success rate, the consumption of the hair, and the hopes that technology would improve someday, what did you make a recommendation? Did you make a recommendation not a conclusion. I hate to say recommendation. We presented all of those findings from the just consultation with the private companies because this is the testing that's not performed in our laboratory. And we presented that to our contributing agency and investigators to let them make that decision. And a decision was made, and I understood that decision and was in agreement with their decision. You didn't make the decision, but you thought it was a reasonable one. I think, given the low success rates and it was a one time opportunity, it was a reasonable decision. Also, the transient nature of hair. There was a concern over what the three hairs that were identified and from what items they were identified on. If we were going to do newer technology and testing, it was a concern of maybe, I submitted 72 hairs, so maybe identifying which hairs were the best use of our resources, of the contributing agency's resources to do that testing. It just was it's a very delicate balance at that point on were these three the most informative and meaningful hairs, or were there others that would provide more meaning? Okay. Last topic, touch DNA. You've done studies and read studies on that and have a practical experience in the laboratory in dealing with looking for skin cells on items. Is that correct? Yes. Has anyone ever come up to you and said, "Is my DNA there?" Yes. Does that ever happen? All the time. In court? In court. Okay, and what's the answer? So, first, I'd like to define a little bit of what touch DNA is because a momentary contact, a physical touch, is different than examining for, skin cells from an item that is known to be handled and worn by someone. So, touch DNA, yes, there may be DNA there, but it's quite possible there's not DNA there. It's dependent again on quantity and quality, how much DNA is in my hands, what the substrate is, the friction, the force that is applied to that single touch, the substrate, if there's any body fluids on my hands when I touch it. It's it all plays a factor, so I can't say for certain that yes, I will get a profile. Really, you're hearkening back to one of our earlier topics, which was good and bad sources of DNA. Is that correct? Yes. Does the quantity of skin covered by clothing affect the number of skin cells that would be left behind, in your opinion? So, for skin cells to be deposited on something, that skin would need to be exposed. So, if the skin was not exposed by being covered by clothing, then it could affect it. But it also, again, depends on what type of DNA is present on the clothing item itself as well. If gloves are worn, obviously that would affect touch DNA involving the fingers and hands. It would prevent the transfer of the DNA from the fingers and hands, but mind you, there could also be DNA on the outside of the gloves. But yes, it would prevent maybe the shredding or shedding from the direct contact. Do you often have scenarios in your work, your laboratory, of examining clothing items left behind by a perpetrator, a ball cap, a shirt, or something that might be left behind? And so, is that something that you've done in the past? Yes. So, clothing items that are left behind are kind of typical routine evidence for our laboratory. Weapons left behind. Do you examine those for touch DNA or skin cells? Yeah, that's something that if it's something is left at a scene or dropped, that is a normal type of item that we may examine. Would you tell the jury the difference in after your research and your training, uh, the difference between handling an item and touching an item? It really just goes back to the amount of DNA that's being deposited. So an item that is being worn or handled, what has, is greater frequency of contact between the skin and that handling and wearing of an item, so a greater chance of skin cells being deposited. So we don't necessarily consider clothing that we're examining for potential wear as touch DNA sample, like we don't define those as one and the same. So touch is more like just a, very limited contact with an item, not something that we persistently had contact with through use or warning. And if it sounds like when you're saying the frequency of use is an important factor in whether or not you can find touch DNA. Yes, there are a variety of factors that play a role in how much DNA I can recover from an item. Is it understood in your discipline the notion of shedder versus a non shedder when it comes to skin cells? That's a terminology that's commonly used in studies in our discipline. We don't typically use it in our analysis, but yes, I am familiar with that terminology. What does it mean? It basically just means that studies have shown that some people can naturally shed more DNA than others, and that might be like all the time. It might just be specific to a day or time or even season, but some people have the capability of shedding more DNA than others. We do all shed DNA. It's just who's the good shedder and poor shedder, low shedder or high shedder. It's the terminology that she's using. As a general rule, can the skin cells on the skin that are subject to coming off, can they diminish with frequency of touch over a short period of time? Is that something that's been documented? Do you understand my question? There have been studies. I do understand, thank you. There have been studies to show, like, if I touch something 5 times in a row, am I going to get more DNA the first time, the last time? There are studies of that, so I am familiar with that type of study. Again, it's just dependent on a lot of factors: force, friction, what's on your hands to begin with. Competitive. The competitive nature of good or poor DNA sources, would you explain what that means? I use that terminology a lot when I'm trying to describe my results in this case. Blood is a good source of DNA. I have a lot of blood off of the clothing items, detected a lot of blood off of the clothing items, item 29, item 30. And if I was trying to swab something for potential skin cells in a sample that has a lot of blood, the comparative nature that I've referenced is that blood is always going to be predominant, like better source of DNA than, maybe a handful of skin cells would be. So if blood, like we men, I mentioned earlier, as a good source, and there's millions of cells within a drop of blood versus just touching something, just depositing a handful of cells. So if the killer were to touch the shoulders or the neck of either Abby Williams or Libby German in the process of this crime, how would the competitive nature of DNA, good and bad DNA, affect your ability to see if that touching ever occurred? I'm just going to say that trying to detect a touch sample in an overwhelming amount of blood is nearly impossible. There's just not going to be enough deposit from a single touch unless that touch also has body fluids on it for me to be able to pull out just the DNA profile of just the skin cell component. The blood component is typically going to be. Ms. Auger says, Your Honor, I'm going to object. She's testifying on facts, not in the record, as to where someone may or may not have touched one of the victims or when they may or may not have touched one of the victims. Mr. Luttrell says, I guess it could have been seen in the form of a hypothetical question, but I said if. I did not suggest that the record shows that at all. Sustained. Did you find the DNA of Richard Allen of any of the items on any of the items? Did you find the DNA of Richard Allen on any of the items that were submitted to you and described by you today that you examined? No, I did not. So all of this rigmarole, all of this 2 hours of her direct testimony, none of it links to Richard Allen. Were you able to develop a DNA profile of any male on any of the items that you examined that you've described here today? I did not develop a male profile that was suitable for comparison purposes from any of the items that I examined and mentioned today. The way she worded that, makes me think she didn't try. 'Cause it said, "Were you able to?" She says, "I did not develop any suitable comparisons." So did she just not do it to maybe not solve this crime? I don't know. Like this whole case is so confusing to me, and I know it's crazy to think like all these people would be in on a conspiracy, but it's not. Look at Karen Reed. Look at the way that Judge Gold has been trying to cover and hide this case from the beginning, and it's that's why it makes me think that maybe there was something in this evidence testing that prevented her purposely to find a male profile. I don't know. Or she was told not to. I don't know. Mr. Luttrell says, "Thank you, Your Honor. I have no further questions." The court says, "As we discussed, we're going to go ahead and break for lunch. So, ladies and gentlemen, again, while you're outside the courtroom, please keep your minds open. Please don't form any opinions or conclusions about anything. You may discuss the evidence that you've heard so far, but please only do that if all 15 of you are present in the jury room at the same time, and please don't deliberate. Gentlemen, all rise." Jury leaves the courtroom. The court says, "You may be seated." And again, if you'll just kind of wait a little bit until the jury gets to the jury room. And I know it's getting warm in here and it's been a long morning, but I've noticed an awful lot, well, several members of our audience sleeping. I'd be sleeping through this woman's testimony too. But that's hilarious. They don't want to listen to run on sentence Stacy Bozinovski. "I don't conduct court in your bedrooms. I would appreciate you not sleeping in my courtroom." I would laugh in her face if she said that to me. "Judge, may we approach?" says Mr. Rosie. The court says yes. Now we have a sidebar conference. Mr. Rosie says, "The exhibit. I'll bring a copy of it." Court says, "Oh, okay." Mr. Rosie says, "Yeah." Court says, "Okay. Nick?" Mr. Rosie says, "I talked with the clerk over here and she was fine with me making copies." The court says, "I don't think I'm seeing her in here." McClellan says, "I've got a picture of her." Court says, "Okay." McClellan says, "I got a picture of her and I'll give it to you so your staff will know." Court says, "Okay." McClellan says, "Oh, this must be Lana Oriani from Truth and Transparency who they're trying to keep out of the courtroom, that they've got a picture of her. That's who they must be talking about from earlier." I didn't have, Mr. McClellan says, "I didn't have their cell phones to be able to do it this in morning court. I was trying to pay attention. So I just thought when we had our stopper here." The court says, "I shared all of that information from you with my staff. I'm not really keen on it, and I don't know if you guys are, but I don't particularly relish the idea of them getting photographs or following you guys. So I don't know about this woman is about. I don't know what this woman is about." Mr. McClellan says, "They already have mine all over, but." Mr. Rosie says, "Yeah, that's okay." Court says, "Well, I get it, but you're a public official." McClellan says, "Yeah, something, something inaudible." Sidebar conference concluded. The court says, "All right, let's resume at 1:30 then, and folks, you can go ahead and leave." And they go off the record, which is where we will end for today. We will come back for another. I- mm, Not sure. I might have to break the next one up into two parts, one or two parts for Stacy Bozinovski, but we'll see as we go forward. So she will be next. I don't know if it's going to be the last one or second to last of hers, but we're getting through hers slowly but surely. She's a talker. She's a talker, like they say in Canton. All right. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I appreciate you. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button on your way out. I will see you guys tomorrow. Take care. Bye now.